The tools were laid out on the table in the order her mother had taught her, tuning hammer first. Then the mutes, 3 of them, rubber-tipped, the smallest one cracked down the side and wrapped in a strip of linen to keep it from splitting further. Then the spare strings. Coiled and labeled in her own hand, because her father's hand shook too badly now to write legibly. Last, the tuning fork. She set it apart from the others. It was the oldest thing in the bag. Older than anything else they still owned. Her mother had bought it from a Flemish craftsman the year Margaret was born, and it had never once been wrong. She picked it up and struck it once against her knee, the note rang out, clean and indifferent. And filled the 2 small rooms above the chandler's shop, and then it faded, and the rooms were quiet again except for the rain on the glass and her father's breathing, which had not been even in months. You don't have to go. He said that he was sitting by the window with a blanket over his knees. Outside the window, the river showed itself in pieces between the rooftops, gray and slow and going somewhere else. He had his hands folded in his lap, the left one cupped around the right to keep it still. That I know. Margaret said. She wrapped the tuning fork in a square of chamois and placed it at the bottom of the canvas bag. Last in, last out. The thing you used only when everything else had been done. That he won't see a craftsman's daughter. Her father's voice was careful. The way a man's voice gets when he has rehearsed a thing and still cannot say it without it costing him. He doesn't see that kind of person. Not about money, then I won't tell him I'm a craftsman's daughter. Margaret folded the chamois over the mutes and settled them beside the strings. I'll tell him the person who has his £400. Or rather, the person who doesn't have it, and would like to discuss the matter before it becomes a different kind of problem. Her father said nothing for a moment. The rain ticked at the glass, the board. He said at last. The soundboard. You'll tell him about the crack. If it comes to that, it wasn't my crack. I told them when I arrived the fracture was already there, running along the base end. Someone had tried to fill it. Badly. Pine resin and chalk, by the look of it. Not a proper repair at all. He paused. His right hand moved slightly under his left. I told his man. I wrote it in the report. They sent the report back. That I know, Papa, unopened. That I know. She had heard this before. She had heard it many times, in many versions. Growing shorter and more compressed as the months passed. The way a piece of wood under sustained pressure stops splintering and simply settles into its new and diminished shape. The injustice had not changed. What had changed was the amount of air her father had left to spend on it. She closed the bag and buckled the 2 straps. Outside. The sky above the river was the color of pewter, and the rain was not stopping. That I should go myself. Her father said, You haven't been downstairs in 11 days. That I could manage the stairs. Margaret looked at him. He looked back at her. He did not say anything else about the stairs. Hell, think you're coming to beg. He said instead. That I am coming to ask for time. She said. That is a different thing. A person asks for time when she believes the debt is real and the intention to pay it is real, but the means require arranging. A person begs when she has nothing. I have something. She picked up the bag by its handle. I have the truth about that soundboard. If he wants it. And I have 2 good ears. Which is more than whatever solicitor he's been using can claim. Her father looked at the bag. His expression was the complicated kind that appears on the faces of people who have spent too long watching the people they love carry weights that should not belong to them. Your mother would have gone. He said. That I know she would. Margaret took her cloak from the hook by the door. It was good wool. It had been good wool, once, before 3 winters and the particular dampness of rooms that sit above a chandler's business. The hem was still clean. Because she cleaned it. The cuffs had been turned once already to hide the wear. She would have gone, and she would have said whatever needed saying. And she would have come home and told us the exact truth about how it went and what we were to do next. She buttoned the cloak to the throat. That I mean to do the same. The walk from the Borough to Mayfair took 40 minutes in dry weather. In the rain. With the streets running with the particular unpleasant mixture of mud and something worse that accumulated near the river on wet mornings, it took longer. Margaret did not take a hackney. The coin it would cost was the same coin that could keep her father in coal for another week. And she had long since stopped making those calculations consciously. They simply resolved themselves. The way a string under proper tension finds its correct pitch without being asked, she arrived at the corner of the square with her hem dark from the wet and her boots in a condition she did not look at too closely. Brookhaven House stood at the far side of the square. And it stood there the way only very old money allows a building to stand, not announcing itself, not requiring anything from you, simply being present in the way a geographical feature is present. It occupied the corner completely. Its windows were tall and their glass was old and good. And they gave back the grey morning sky without comment. Margaret stood across from it and looked at it, then she crossed the square, walked up the front steps, and let the knocker fall. The footman who opened the door was perhaps 20 years old and powdered within an inch of his natural appearance, and he looked at her hem before he looked at her face. What he found in her face, after he had taken a moment to look, did not improve his initial assessment. Deliveries at the area entrance. He said that I am not delivering anything, Margaret said. I have a matter of business with the Duke of Brookhaven. My name is Miss Margaret Ashton. He won't know it. But I believe the account I've come regarding will be familiar to his household. The footman weighed this. She waited while he did it. She had been weighed her entire life by customers who wondered whether a craftsman's daughter truly understood what she claimed to understand about a Flemish harpsichord. Hoard from the previous century, by landlords considering whether her father's reputation was still sound enough to justify the rent. By women in churches who looked at her plain dress and made their quiet arithmetic visible in their expressions. She had developed a patience for it that was not quite patience and not quite resignation, but something worn smooth between the two. His Grace does not receive callers without cards. The footman said, then I'll wait until someone is willing to carry my name inside, Margaret said. I am already wet, as you can see, so standing in a dry hall cannot be described as an imposition on your part. Something shifted in the young man's expression, not warmth, but a small recalibration. The kind that happens when a person has prepared for one sort of conversation and found themselves in a different one. He stepped back, and she stepped in. And he left her standing on the black and white marble floor while he went to ask. The hall was very cold and very tall. A staircase rose at the far end, disappearing into shadow. On the walls, men in formal coats looked out of gilt frames with the uniform expression of people who had sat for portraits they considered beneath their time. Margaret did not look at them for long. She looked instead at the door to the left of the staircase, which was closed, with a dark curtain drawn across it that was slightly too large for its frame, as though it had been chosen in a hurry or from another room. She stood still and let herself listen. The house made the sounds that large, cold, old houses make, the settling of stone, the pressure of wind against glass, the distant movement of servants in lower rooms. And under all of it, so faint that a person who was not accustomed to listening for exactly this kind of silence would not have noticed it. There was the particular quality of absence that belongs to a room with a musical instrument that has not been played in a very long time. She had grown up in rooms with instruments in them. Her father's workshop had always held 3 or 4 at various stages of repair. And she had learned early that instruments are not passive in their silence. A well-maintained instrument, resting, sounds different from a neglected one. The difference is not audible. Precisely. It is more like the difference between a sleeping person and a person who has been left in a room too long and become part of the stillness. Behind that curtained door, something had been left in a room too long. She did not approach it. She stood where she had been left and listened. And she was still listening when the sound of footsteps on the staircase brought her attention back to the hall. The woman who descended was old and very upright, dressed entirely in dove gray without a single piece of ornament. Her hair was white and her eyes were the kind of clear that only comes from decades of deciding what to look at and what to leave unseen. She came down slowly, one hand on the rail. And she looked at Margaret all the way down with an expression that was not unkind but was also not pretending to be anything other than a thorough examination. You are the Ashton girl, the woman said when she reached the floor. That I am Miss Margaret Ashton. Yes, that I am Lady Dorothea, the Duke's great-aunt. In this house, I maintain what my great-nephew lacks the patience to maintain, which amounts to a considerable portion of the domestic administration. She tilted her head slightly. You came alone. No maid, no carriage. No letter of introduction. A hired carriage is money, Margaret said. And a letter cannot stand in a room and say what it needs to say in the way a person can. What does it need to say? That the debt is real, and we know it. And we are not running from it. She paused. And that the account of what happened to the soundboard is not what my father was accused of. Those are two separate things. And they want saying in the right order. Lady Dorothea considered her for a long moment. The rain continued at the tall windows. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock made a sound that was not quite a chime. Most people in your position, Lady Dorothea said, send a solicitor, or a letter. Or nothing at all, and simply begin the process of becoming unfindable. Yes, my lady, and why have you not done one of those more practical things? Because a debt is easier to forgive when a person is standing in front of you saying the word for it. Margaret said. And someone in my family ought to stand in front of the man we owe and say it. My father cannot stand in front of anyone at the moment. So it is to be me. She held the old woman's gaze. I would rather be here and be refused than not be here at all. Lady Dorothea's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shape a smile might take if it decided not to fully commit. Come up, she said. The staircase was wide enough for two, and they climbed it together at the pace Lady Dorothea's knees required. Which was a pace that allowed Margaret time to observe the upper hall, more portraits, more disappointed men, a series of doors all closed, and at the end of the corridor, a set of double doors in pale wood that stood slightly apart from their frame. As though the house was breathing, Lady Dorothea stopped before a different door, this one alone on the left side of the corridor, and opened it without knocking. The Ashton girl is here, Marcus, she said. She came in the rain with no carriage and no maid to discuss her father's debt in person. Try to remember she is a person before she is an account. Then she walked to the chair nearest the fire, sat down, folded her hands, and became, by all appearances, part of the furniture. Margaret looked at the room. It was a library, and it was enormous. The kind of room that makes a person understand immediately and without particular emotion that they have never been in a room like it before. Books covered the walls to a gallery and the gallery to the ceiling. 3 tall windows looked out onto a garden that was grey and wet and entirely without life. And at the center window, his back to the door, stood a man. He was tall, and his coat was plain and very well made, and his hands were clasped behind him. And he was looking at the dead garden below as though it owed him an explanation that had not yet been provided. He did not turn immediately. He turned. He was younger than she had built him in the weeks of anticipating this meeting, perhaps 32. With a face that was neither cruel nor warm but something more difficult than either, still, the way a room is still when the person who usually occupies it has been gone a long time. His eyes were an unusual color, amber lit from somewhere behind the iris. And they came to rest on her face and did not move to her hem, which she noted, because most people moved to her hem. Miss Ashton, he said. His voice was low and very even. Or Grace. She did not curtsy more than was required. She had decided on the walk over that she would give him exactly the deference that was owed and not 1 degree more. Because a person who gives more deference than is owed is a person who has already decided she is worth less than she is, and she could not afford that decision before she had said what she had come to say. Sit. He said that I would rather stand. What I've come to say is easier said standing. Something moved in his expression, not a smile, but the memory of where a smile might have lived once. Then say it. She did not read from the account. She had memorized it. And a person should not read an apology. My father is William Ashton, she said. He is a piano maker and tuner. 7 years ago, he was engaged by your household to assess and tune the harpsichord belonging to your mother, the late Duchess. He found the instrument in poor condition, specifically a fracture along the base end of the soundboard, running approximately 4 inches from the pin block toward the bridge. He documented this in a written report and recommended immediate repair. The report was returned to him unopened. He was subsequently dismissed without payment. And a counterclaim was filed against him for the cost of the assessment and for alleged damage to the instrument. That claim has accumulated interest. The current figure is £412, she paused. That we do not have £412. We do not have £400. My father's right hand has not been steady enough to work for the better part of a year, and what work he could do before that was already diminished by the legal matter. Because men who have had a counterclaim filed against them for damaging a Duchess harpsichord do not receive many new commissions. She held his gaze. I have not come to argue the debt. I have come to tell you we know it is there, and to ask you for time. Because time is the only thing I am in a position to ask for, and I would rather ask for it in person than send a letter that could be ignored. The Duke of Brookhaven looked at her for a moment without speaking. You said the claim was for alleged damage. He said, yes, you believe the damage was pre-existing. That I know it was pre-existing. My father documented it. The documentation was sent back unopened. She stopped. Then she said the rest of it. Because she had come this far and it wanted saying. I cannot prove it to you today. I don't have the original report. But I know my father's work, and I know what he is and is not capable of. And he is not capable of lying about a soundboard. He has been lying about nothing for 53 years and he is not going to develop the skill now. There was a silence. It was the Duke who broke it, and he broke it in a direction she had not expected. You came alone. He said that yes.no solicitor. No letter. A solicitor costs money, and a letter cannot say what wants saying. And what, he said slowly, did you think this visit would accomplish? I thought it might accomplish the difference between a number on a page and a person in a room. A number on a page is only arithmetic. A person in a room is something you have to look at. She kept her voice level. I thought if you looked at me, you might find it more difficult to simply proceed with the legal action. I may have been wrong. But I thought it was worth finding out. That he looked at her. She looked back. The fire spoke into the silence, and the rain spoke against the windows. And the room waited. Then his gaze moved just slightly, just for a moment, to the curtained doorway in the far wall. It was not a conscious movement. She was nearly certain of that. It was the kind of involuntary thing the body does when the mind circles back, against its will, to a fixed point. She had seen her father do it with his right hand reach for a tool that was no longer where it used to be, the gesture half formed before he caught himself. She looked at the curtained doorway. The curtain was heavy, dark green wool. And it was not quite the right size for the door frame. It covered the door entirely, floor to lintel. And it had been there long enough that a faint line of discoloration marked the wall above it where a previous curtain rod had been removed. The room on the other side of that curtain was not empty. She could not have said precisely how she knew this. It was not sound, exactly. Or not only sound. It was the way the air in the library moved near that wall, the particular quality of the silence behind the cloth, dense and specific. The silence of a room that contains something that has been waiting a very long time. She took 2 steps toward it before she understood that she had moved. Miss Ashton, his voice stopped her, not sharp, but with a quality of attention that had not been there a moment before. She turned. He was watching her with an expression that was very still and very focused, and his hands, which had been clasped behind him, had come to his sides. That room is not in use, he said. No. She agreed. I can hear that. A pause. What can you hear? She considered how to answer this. A person who did not spend a significant portion of her life listening to the internal states of wooden instruments might not have a vocabulary for it. A person who did had perhaps too much vocabulary. And the challenge was choosing the words that would be understood rather than the words that were most accurate. A harpsichord, she said. Or what used to be one. The strings have gone slack. You can hear it in the way the room absorbs sound differently than it would if the instrument were in tension. And the pin block will have shifted without the string pressure to hold it. If it hasn't been touched in. She stopped. How long has it been closed? He did not answer immediately. 6 years, he said. She did her arithmetic in silence. 6 years of no humidity control, no string tension, no one checking the soundboard for further movement. The soundboard crack will have propagated, she said. It was not an accusation. It was simply what would have happened, given the conditions. Whether the original fracture was 4 inches or 40, 6 years unattended in a London room will have moved it. Possibly considerably. I am aware of that, the Duke said. Are you? She said it without thinking, and then heard herself say it, and did not apologize, because it was a genuine question. Then you know that if the board has split entirely, the instrument is beyond. Miss Ashton. Repair by conventional methods, yes. I'll stop. She stopped. The fire ticked. She looked at the curtain and then back at him and found that he was still watching her with that focused, unreadable expression. Forgive me. It's a professional reflex. When someone tells me a room has had a musical instrument in it for 6 years without maintenance, I find it very difficult to concentrate on anything else. Another silence. Longer, this time, you know the instrument. He said. Not a question. By reputation. Everyone in the trade knows it or knows of it. A Flemish harpsichord, Italian painted case, your mother's. She kept her voice careful and even, because she could see what the mention of his mother cost him. And she was not trying to spend that. My father spoke of it. He said it was the finest thing he had ever been asked to work on. He said it was tuned a quarter tone below modern pitch, which is unusual. And that the lower register in particular had a quality he had never heard in any other instrument. The Duke had gone very still. He said all that, Margaret continued, more quietly. In the same conversation in which he explained to me why he no longer accepted private commissions. He told me about the report he sent, and the report that came back. And the letter from the solicitors. He told me about all of it. And then he said. She paused. He said it was the finest thing he had ever been asked to work on, and that he hoped someone was taking care of it. She let that sit for a moment. No one is taking care of it. She said. I can hear that from here. The Duke of Brookhaven stood at the window with the dead garden behind him and looked at her for a long time without speaking. Something was happening in his face, not visible, exactly, but present. The way a change in temperature is present in a room before you can put a name to the sensation. Come back on Thursday. He said at last. In the morning. I will have an answer regarding the account. That it was not yes. It was not no. It was the most a man like this gave to a woman like her at a first meeting. And she had been raised to understand the difference between the most that was on offer and the least that would do. Thank you, Your Grace, she said. She was almost at the door when he spoke again. Miss Ashton. She stopped. The lower register. He said. That quality my father described in the lower register. He said it was like hearing a room the instrument had been in. Rather than the instrument itself. As though the wood had absorbed something and was still holding it. A pause. He said it was the only instrument he had ever tuned that seemed to be listening back. She stood still for a moment. That is a very good harpsichord. She said. Or it was, and she went out, and left him standing in the grey light with the curtained door behind him. Lady Dorothea did not leave immediately after Miss Ashton had gone. She sat by the fire for another few minutes, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes on the middle distance that she had found, over 81 years, to be the most productive thing to look at when thinking. Then she rose, without hurrying. And crossed to where her great-nephew stood at the window. That he did not turn. He was looking at the garden. The garden had been dead for 6 years. She had watched it die, first the herbaceous beds, then the climbing roses along the south wall. Then the old espaliered pear that Frances had trained herself over 15 years of patient autumn mornings. Now it was a rectangle of black beds and grey gravel, and the skeleton of the glasshouse along the south wall, its iron gone to rust. Half its panes gone entirely. Marcus looked at it the way he looked at most things, as though the looking were a form of surveillance rather than engagement. She heard it. Dorothea said, yes, through the curtain, from across the library. In the middle of a conversation about a debt. She paused. I have been in this house for 6 years, Marcus. I have walked past that door 3,000 times. I have never once heard anything. You were not listening for it, and she was. He did not answer. Which was its own kind of answer. Dorothea looked at the garden. The rain was heavier now, flattening what remained of the dead growth in the beds, running in thin silver lines down the iron ribs of the glasshouse frame. Millicent's will gives you 22 days. She said. You have already declined every suitable candidate that the season has produced. Lady Carworth. The Featherstone girl. Both the Alderton daughters, one of which was, by any reasonable standard, a genuinely lovely person. Genuinely lovely persons wish to be genuinely loved. Marcus said. I could not oblige any of them. You could have tried that. I did try. With each of them, I sat across a table and tried to imagine the rest of my life, and what I found was not unpleasant, exactly, but it was. He stopped. He had the habit of stopping before the precise word. As though precision were something to be approached carefully. Airless, he said. It felt like a room with no windows. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. 22 days. She said again. Oakhold has 400 tenants. You are fond of reminding me that you don't require sentiment in order to do your duty. That I am aware of the duty, and yet. He was still looking at the garden. A length of the old espaliered pear had come loose from the wall in the rain and was hanging at an odd angle, held by a single rusted wire. She said the soundboard crack will have propagated. Dorothea waited. She said it as though it were simply what would happen. He continued. Given the conditions. Not as an indictment. Just a material fact. Stated by someone who understood materials. He turned the loose pear branch with his eyes for a moment. She said my father hoped someone was taking care of it, and someone is not. No Marcus that I know. She came in the rain with a canvas tool bag and no card and no legal representation. And she told you in plain language that the debt was real, and she told you in plainer language that the documentation had been sent back unopened. And she did not once suggest that you were responsible for that. Dorothea let this settle. And then she heard your mother's harpsichord through a curtained door. He said nothing. That I in 22 days, she said. You must marry someone. I am not suggesting she is obvious. I am not suggesting anything. I am observing that you have refused every woman I have placed in front of you this season. And that the only moment I have seen your attention genuinely arrested was approximately 12 minutes ago when a craftsman's daughter from the borough told you she could hear a pin block shifting. That he turned from the window at last. His face was, as it nearly always was, unreadable. But Dorothea had been reading it for 32 years, which was longer than he had been alive, and she could read the version of it that did not show. Ask her to come back on Thursday, he said. I told her Thursday that I heard you. That I need to think. You have been thinking for 6 years. She said. Not unkindly. About the garden. About the room. About whether a thing that has been closed that long can be opened without breaking. She moved toward the door. Perhaps the question is not whether it can be opened. Perhaps the question is whose hands you want doing the opening. She left him with Th. E. dead garden and the curtained door and the rain on the glass. That he stood there for a long time after she had gone. Then he turned and looked at the curtain. That he did not approach it. He never approached it. But he stood for a moment looking at it from across the room. As he did sometimes when the house was quiet enough and he had been sufficiently off his guard, and then he turned back to the window and put his attention where he had learned to keep it. The loose branch of the pear tree swung once in the rain. And was still. She came back on Thursday. The footman who opened the door this time did not look at her hem. He stepped back without comment and led her upstairs, which meant that Lady Dorothea had spoken to someone, or that her name had been left with someone. And either way she had been expected. This was a different thing from being welcome, but it was closer to it than her first visit had been, and she noted the distance traveled. The library was the same. The fire was lit. The curtain over the far door was the same dark green wool. The rain, which had apparently decided to become a permanent feature of this spring, was doing the same thing it had been doing on Monday to the tall windows. The Duke was not at the window this time. He was standing beside the fireplace with one hand on the mantel. And he turned when she came in immediately, without the pause of Monday, and looked at her with an expression that told her nothing except that whatever he had decided it completely. Sit down, Miss Ashton. He said. And before you tell me you would rather stand, what I have to say will take some time, and I would prefer you to hear all of it before you respond to any part of it. Saturday she folded her wet gloves in her lap and waited. Because she had learned that waiting was one of the few things she could do in rooms like this that cost nothing and lost nothing. That I will forgive the debt, he said. The full amount. £412, and all accrued interest. Cancelled entirely. It will be as though the account never existed. The breath went out of her. Your Grace. I haven't finished. She closed her mouth. That I will forgive the debt, he continued, in the same level voice. And I will additionally settle a sum upon your father sufficient for him to live without anxiety for the remainder of his life in the country, where the air is better than it is above a chandler's shop in the borough. And where he will not need to work if his hand does not allow it. He paused. I will do these things on one condition, and I am going to ask you to hear the whole of the condition before you speak, because it will offend you. And I would rather you be offended by the truth than by half of it. Margaret looked at him. Say it, she said. That I must marry within 20 days. He did not look away from her. My great-aunt Millicent, who did not love me with any particular warmth but loved Oakhold considerably, left the entailed estate against a clause. I must have a wife before my 33rd birthday, which falls at the end of this month. If I do not, Oakhold passes to my cousin, who will sell the tenant farms to settle his own debts. And the 400 families who currently live on that land will have 6 months to find somewhere else to go. I did not write the clause. I have spent the better part of a year deeply resenting it. But it is the law. And the law has no interest in what I resent. That he moved then away from the mantel, one slow step, then another, until he was standing in the middle of the room with the fire behind him and the dead garden behind the windows. That I am asking you to marry me, Miss Ashton, he said. Not as a convenience to be set aside when it suits me. A wife, in law and before God, with everything a duchess is owed: title, settlement, protection. A household that is yours to manage as you see fit. Your father's debt forgiven. Your father provided for. And you placed in a position from which no one can send you to anyone's door again on someone else's behalf. He stopped. In exchange, I am asking you to save 400 families you have never met by standing beside me in a church before the end of the month. That is the whole of it. You may be as angry as you please. The fire spoke. The rain spoke. Margaret sat with her wet gloves in her lap and looked at the man who had just offered her a duchess coronet in exchange for a signature and a date, and she was not angry. She examined the fact of this with some care, because it seemed like the kind of fact that wanted examining. She had expected to be angry. She had constructed, on the walk over, a reasonable architecture of indignation to deploy in the event of something like this. And now she found the architecture was still there, but she was not inside it, because what he had offered her was not what she had prepared for. What he had offered her was the truth. Plainly, completely. Without decoration. She was not used to that. You are not asking me, she said quietly. You are asking anyone. You would say these same words to any respectable woman who happened to be standing in this room today. Any woman without prospects of her own, without family to make terms, without a dowry to negotiate with. You have found in a debtor's daughter a woman who can be had quickly and cheaply and who will be grateful. She held his gaze. I know the shape of that arrangement. Your Grace. I have been the convenient one my entire life. I can recognize it in the dark. She had thought this would make him flinch, or deflect, or produce some version of the denial she had seen men offer when a true thing was said to them too directly. That he said, yes, just that. Flat. Immediate, with no attempt to soften it. You don't deny it that I told you I would say the whole of the truth, he said. You are right in nearly all of it. I need a wife by a date. You are unmarried, respectable. In no position to refuse a duke. That is a significant part of why you are sitting in that chair, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. I am too tired for pretending, and I suspect you are too, and pretending would be an insult to both of us. But, she said, because there was a but. She could hear it in the architecture of what he had said, the weight of it, the shape that required something to follow. But, he said. You said I would say these words to anyone. And that is the one thing you are wrong about. That he crossed to the chair opposite her and sat down the first time he had sat in her presence. The first time they had been at the same level, and his amber eyes came to rest on her face with an attention that was not comfortable to receive, because it was entirely genuine. This month, I have refused 17 women. He said. My aunt made a list at the beginning of the season and I have worked through it. Some were amiable. Several were genuinely accomplished. At least 2 were the sort of person I could imagine liking very much under different circumstances. And with every one of them, I sat across a room and tried to imagine a life. And what I found was he paused. A door closing. The sound of it. Something becoming smaller. That he looked at her steadily. Then a woman came in from the rain with a canvas tool bag and told me she could hear my mother's harpsichord through a curtain door. She told me it was listening back. The way an instrument does when it has been made by someone who understood what making an instrument means. He stopped. She didn't play it. She didn't ask to play it. She simply heard it, the way you hear something you have the right kind of ears for, and named what she heard. And left out a silence that I can imagine. The breakfast table, he said. That is all I have to tell you. It is a small thing. It is the only honest thing I have. Besides the money. I did not choose you because you were the most convenient option. I chose you because you heard the instrument. Margaret sat very still. She had been looked at her entire life by customers, by creditors, by neighbors in the narrowing sequence of streets they had moved through as the money went. She had been looked at and weighed and found acceptable or not acceptable and filed accordingly. She knew every variety of being looked at. She did not know this variety. This was someone sitting level with her and telling her he had chosen her for the true thing in her, the one thing that was hers, the thing that no change of address or reduction of circumstance had ever been able to take away. Because it lived in her ears and her hands, and the part of her mind that had been trained on the precise difference between a string that was right and a string that was almost right, she did not weep. She had trained herself out of weeping in front of people who held her future. But something sure feated in her chest, the way a string shifts when the tension is finally correct, a small, definitive movement, and then stillness. That I don't know you, she said. No. Nor I you. That is what the years are for, if you will spend them. He held her gaze. I am a cold man, Miss Ashton. People find me difficult. I cannot promise you warmth every evening because I don't always know how to produce it. But I will promise you the truth always, in full, without omission. I will promise you your own money in your own hand. And I will promise you. He stopped. And something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I will promise you the instrument, if you can save it. Whatever it takes. Whatever you need. It would be yours to work on. Margaret looked past him at the curtain door. Show me. She said. Take me in and let me assess it. Then I'll give you my answer. He looked at her for a long moment, then he stood, and he offered her his arm, and she took it. He unlocked the door himself. The key was on his person, not sent for, not produced by a servant, simply there. As though he had been carrying it for 6 years without quite deciding what to do with it. The curtain, drawn back, revealed a door of pale wood with a brass handle that had gone green at the edges. He turned the key. The lock was stiff. He had to work it twice, and she did not offer to help. Because some things want to be done by the person they belong to. The door opened. The smell came first, old wood and rosin, and the specific mustiness of a room that has been sealed against London air for years. Not unpleasant. Dense. Like opening a book that hasn't been read in a long time, and thin. Ding, the smell of the paper is the same as it ever was. She went in before him, which she suspected was not conventional, but convention was not what was wanted here. The room was smaller than she had expected from the quality of the instrument she had heard. A single tall window. Its shutters closed. A chair in the corner with a piece of cloth over it. On the wall, a small painting, A Garden in Summer, the paint fine and careful, signed in the lower corner in a hand too small to read from the door, and in the center of the room, under a cloth of dark blue wool. The harpsichord. She went to the window first. She opened the shutters. The gray light came in thin, winter thin. But light and fell across the instrument's covered shape and the bare boards of the floor and the dust that moved in the air where she had disturbed it. She heard him come to stand in the doorway, but she did not look back. She took hold of the corner of the blue cloth and lifted it, slowly. The way you lift something when you're not certain what you'll find underneath and you want to give yourself a moment before you find it. The case was dark wood, the color of old honey, with painted panels on the sides, flowers and songbirds. The paint still vivid despite 6 years of sealed darkness, done by a hand that knew what it was doing. The lid was down. The natural keys had yellowed. The sharps were still dark. She put her hand on the case. She did not press. She simply placed her palm flat against the wood and held it there. Feeling for temperature, for the quality of the surface, for the information that would gives to a hand that knows how to ask. Then she lifted the lid. The strings were all present. 3 of them had broken, but the breaks were old and clean, the ends curled back on themselves. Not rust damaged. The soundboard. She leaned in, angling toward the light from the window. The soundboard had a crack running along the bass register, as her father had documented, and a second, smaller fracture that had opened in the 6 years since. Branching from the first like a river finding a new channel, she ran one finger along the edge of the larger crack. The wood on either side was still sound. Not soft, not punky. Not crumbling. The bridge was intact. The nut had shifted slightly but had not detached. She moved to the end of the instrument and crouched, examining the pin block from below. The soundboard has moved, she said. Her voice came out steady. Because this was work and work steadied her. But the wood is alive. That's the first thing. The board hasn't died, it's moved. Movement can be addressed. Death is a different problem. She pressed lightly on the board at 2 points. Feeling for flexibility, the bridge is still glued. I can see the original repair my father mentioned here, at the base end, pine resin over a previous fracture, probably 40 years old at minimum. She looked more closely. The new crack has followed the same grain as the old repair. Which means it was always going to open there regardless of who serviced it last. The wood was following its own history. She stood, she looked at the instrument for a moment, taking the whole of it in the painted case, the broken strings, the cracked board, the dust. The 6 years of being covered and left and not touched. That it isn't dead, she said. It has been sealed in a room and left to manage on its own for 6 years, and it is angry about that, but it is not dead. The case is sound. The action needs complete restoration. The jacks will have warped. The quills will be useless, the dampers will need replacing entirely. 3 new strings in the treble. The soundboard will need to be stabilized and cleated from below before new string tension is applied. It can't be rushed. Probably 8 to 10 weeks of work. If the work is done correctly. She turned and found that he had come into the room, that he was standing just inside the doorway, not close, not far, but in the room. Which was where he had not been for 6 years, and he was looking at the harpsichord with an expression that was not the stone she had seen in the library. It was something older than stone, something that had been underneath the stone the whole time. And the stone had only just come off. She let the silence be what it was. After a long moment, he said, "My mother used to play it in the mornings. Before anyone else was awake. I would hear it from my room, and I would lie still and listen. And it seemed to me that the whole house was different when she was playing. The way the air felt." Margaret said nothing. She was playing the morning she died. Or she had been. She stopped mid-piece. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I was 12. He stopped. I came in when it was quiet. And the lid was still up. Another silence. "That I closed it," he said. "That was the first thing I did. I came in, and the lid was up, and I closed it. And I locked the room, eventually. When it became clear that I could not." He stopped again. He had the habit of stopping at the word that cost the most. "When I found I couldn't come in without the house becoming the wrong size." Margaret looked at the instrument. Then she looked at him. "It wasn't the lid you closed," she said quietly. It was the last thing she had been doing when she was still alive. That's not the same as closing a harpsichord. She paused. "You preserved it." In the only way you knew how, at 12 years old. You preserved the last thing she had touched. A breath. That's not something to be ashamed of. He said nothing. The string tension, she said, is still partially present in the pins, Margaret continued, keeping her voice on the practical because the practical was what he could receive right now. And because she had learned that you calibrate to the instrument you are working with. She tuned it herself, probably. That particular pitch a quarter tone below modern, that's a deliberate choice. Not an accident. Whoever plays it next will be playing in the tuning she chose. The room was very quiet. You asked for my answer, she said. I'll give it to you now. She turned to face him fully, the covered instrument behind her. The pale light from the window falling between them. I won't marry you for the £400. I won't marry you for the coronet, which frightens me considerably. I will marry you because this instrument can be saved, and I am the person who can save it, and when I have saved it, no one will be able to say I was purchased. You cannot purchase what a person makes with their hands out of broken wood. It will be mine, done by my work. And it will be real. She held his gaze. That is my reason. It is not a fashionable reason for a duchess. It is the only true one I have. Take it or leave it. The Duke of Brookhaven stood in his mother's room, in the thin grey light. With the dust still moving in the air around them, something crossed his face that had not been there before, not guarded at all, just present, the way a room is present when someone finally opens the window. I'll take it. He said. They were married 9 days later. It was a small wedding by special license, in the grey church at the corner of the square. Lady Dorothea and 4 members of the household staff stood as witnesses. No one came from society, because there had been no time to invite society. And neither of them had suggested making time. The license had been obtained on Friday. The church had been arranged on Saturday. By Wednesday morning it was done. Margaret wore a dress of soft blue-grey that Lady Dorothea had ordered without consulting her and refused to be thanked for. Her father was too unwell to travel from the borough, and so he was not there, and she did not let herself think about that until afterward, when the thinking could be done privately. At the altar, the Duke said the words in his low, even voice. The voice of a man who does not make promises carelessly and is therefore making this one with the full weight of his attention. She said them back, and meant them further than she had expected to, when he placed the ring on her finger. His hand was steady. Hers was not. He felt it, she saw him feel it, the slight adjustment of his grip, and he closed his hand over hers, not firmly, but with the precise and calibrated pressure of a person who understands that a thing under too much tension will break. And under too little will go silent. That was not in the service. She did not forget it. There, he said quietly, when the rector had finished and they had turned from the altar. You are a duchess. No one may send you to anyone's door again. A pause. Where would you like to go first? She said. The instrument room. Behind them, Lady Dorothea made a sound that might have been a cough. The first 2 weeks were careful. That was the word Margaret kept returning to, careful. In the way that new things are careful with each other before they have established the terms of engagement. They were polite at meals. They were considerate in the arrangement of their days. He worked in the library in the mornings, she worked in the instrument room. They met at dinner, where the table was long and the candles burned in the middle, and there was a great deal of space between them that neither had yet decided what to do with. She had grown up in rooms where silence was expensive, where the absence of conversation usually meant the presence of something worse. She had learned to fill silence, or to navigate it, or to find its texture and determine what it was made of. The silence at the dinner table was not hostile. It was not even uncomfortable, precisely. It was simply there. The way a piece of furniture is there in a room before you have determined whether it belongs or whether it has simply been there long enough that removing it feels like a statement. She worked on the harpsichord every morning. She had brought her father's tools from the borough, the full set. Not just the bag she had carried to the first meeting, but the wooden chest that held everything. The chisels and the bone folders and the hide glue pot and the collection of spare jacks in varying stages of completion that her father had accumulated over 30 years of being unwilling to throw away a piece of work before it was entirely finished. The chest was old and battered and had her Gra. And father's initials burned into the lid, and it looked considerably out of place in a room whose other furnishings had been made to order in Florence. She found she did not mind the contrast, the jacks were as bad as she had anticipated, warped by the dry air of the sealed room. The quills brittle and splitting. She stripped them entirely and began recutting. Which was tedious work that required good light and steady hands and the kind of patience that comes not from temperament but from having done the same thing many hundreds of times before. She worked in the mornings until the light failed or her hands tired, whichever came first, that eye, and the evenings. Before dinner, she sometimes heard footsteps in the corridor outside the instrument room. They would stop outside the door, and then, after a moment, continue on. She had not mentioned this to him, she was not certain what she would say if she did. She was not certain what it meant. Or whether it meant anything. Or whether she was simply learning to hear a house that was new to her and assigning significance to ordinary sounds because the silence at the dinner table had made her more attentive than usual to what moved outside of it. One evening she stayed later than she meant to. The light had gone, but he had a candle, and she was cutting new quills by candlelight, which was not ideal but was preferable to stopping, because she was almost through the treble register and she did not like leaving work half finished. She had the instrument open, the lid propped. The candle set at the far end to keep the heat away from the soundboard. She heard the footsteps stop outside the door. They stopped for longer than usual. She kept cutting. The quill in her hand required attention. Crow quill, the right stiffness for the upper register. Cut at the correct angle to give the right degree of resistance against the string. After a long moment, the footsteps moved on. She set down the quill knife and looked at the door and then at the open instrument in front of her, the strings catching the candlelight. The new jacks in their ordered rows. The soundboard with its cleated crack running along the bass like a river that had found its proper channel and decided to stay there. She picked up her mother's tuning fork from the workbench and struck it once against her knee. The note rang out into the room, clean and certain, and faded. And she sat with the silence that came after it and thought about footsteps that stopped outside doors. The third week, she asked him about his mother at dinner. She had been considering it for several days, not the asking itself, which she had decided on, but the approach. There was a way to ask about a dead person that made the asking feel like permission, like you were requesting entrance into a room that the other person had left locked, and you wanted them to understand that you understood this. And that you were not going to pretend the lock wasn't there. She had found, in her experience of grief adjacent to her father's, that the worst thing you could do was knock too briskly. She set down her spoon. Tell me about her, she said. Your mother. I am working with her instrument every day. And I know the instrument, I know the wood she chose and the pitch she preferred and the style of the painted case, but I don't know anything about the woman who chose those things. That seems wrong to me. A person ought to know whose work they're sitting in the middle of. The Duke was quiet. Not unco. For tabloquiet, more the quiet of someone who has been asked a question in a language they were once fluent in and are finding their way back to. She was not fashionable. He said at last. His voice was careful in a way that told her the words were being chosen from a larger supply. My father married her for her portion. And was considerably surprised to find she had no particular interest in the things that portions were supposed to purchase. She didn't care for society. She cared for music, and for the garden. And for he stopped. She cared for things she could make with her hands. The garden she had planned herself. The instrument she had commissioned herself, from a maker in Antwerp, when she was 22, before she was married. With money she had saved specifically for that purpose, she saved for it, for 4 years. Something moved in his expression. My father found this incomprehensible. He could have bought her 3 harpsichords without noticing the expenditure. She said it was not the same thing that it isn't. Margaret said no. I understand that now. I didn't when I was a boy. He looked at the candles for a moment. I thought a duchess ought to want grander things than garden beds and a harpsichord she had saved for herself. I have since come to think she was the wisest person I have ever known. And that wisdom of that particular kind tends to look like eccentricity to people who are not paying attention. What was she called? Frances. He said the name the way you say a word you have kept in a closed drawer for a long time carefully, to make sure it still worked. Frances Eleanor. Though she used only the first, Margaret did not rush. She had learned that comfort offered too quickly is only a way of asking the grieving person to stop. She picked up her wine glass and set it down again, giving the name time to be in the room. She died in the spring. He said. It had the quality of something he was telling himself as much as her. In 3 days. A fever. The beds in the garden were half planted. She had been out that morning before she felt unwell, and she had left the trowel stuck upright in one of the beds. And I could see it from the window of her room while he stopped. While she was ill. I kept looking at it. I didn't know why. I think I thought that as long as it was still there, she was still intending to come back to it. The candles burned. The rain, which had been a constant companion of this particular spring, spoke at the windows. She was playing the harpsichord the morning she died. Margaret said. Or she had been. Yes, she stopped mid-piece. The Goldberg variations. The 14th variation. I know it because I counted afterward. I found the score and counted. She had played 13 and stopped on the 14th. He was very still. I don't know why I needed to know that. I'd to know it. Margaret sat with this for a moment. The strings have been in mourning since then. She said quietly. That's what slack strings are, tension that has nowhere to go. It doesn't mean the strings are wrong. It means they're waiting to be of use again. She held his gaze across the candlelight. You sealed the room because you loved her and you were 12 years old, and sealing the room was the only thing you could think to do. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is what 12 years old does with a loss that size. That he looked at her, and the 20 years since. He said. I was not 12 for 20 years. No. But grief is not linear, and you know that. Or you wouldn't have kept carrying the key on your person. She kept her voice level. You have been keeping the tension of that string somewhere it couldn't sound. That is what sealed rooms are. They are the places we put the tension when we don't know what else to do with it. A pause. Sealed rooms make terrible storage. The pressure builds without release, and eventually the wood cracks. She saw him understand what she was not saying. The soundboard, he said. The soundboard followed the grain it was always going to follow. She said. But 6 years of sealed pressure didn't help. The silence that followed was not the silence of the dinner table. It was a different material, entirely warmer, and more willing to hold the weight of what had been put in it. No one has spoken to me like this, he said. Since she died. People are very careful with me. They are careful the way people are careful of something that might. He stopped. I find I do not want you to be careful with me. It is the strangest thing. I have spent years constructing a house no one could get into. And somehow I have married a woman who simply walks through the walls as though they were painted on. That I don't know how to be careful, Margaret said. I never had the time to learn it. In the life I have been living, you say the true thing when you can. Because by morning something may have changed and the true thing may no longer be sayable. She paused. I'm sorry if it is too much. Don't be sorry, he said. Don't, on any account, learn to be careful. I am a duke and I am told I may issue 1 prohibition per quarter. And that is the one I choose. Margaret looked at him across the island of candlelight, this man who had just made a joke small, dry, barely visible as a joke, like a single lamp in a window at a very long distance, and something in her chest did the thing it had been doing more frequently recently. The movement like a string finding its correct tension, small and definitive. She did not say anything about it, but she stopped thinking of the dinner table as a piece of furniture that was simply there. Later that evening, after they had parted at the top of the stairs. She passed the instrument room on the way to her own room and stopped. She went in. By candlelight, she took the tuning fork from the workbench, struck it against her knee, and held it to the wood of the case just for a moment. Letting the vibration pass from metal to wood to the still air of the room, the note faded. She put the fork back in the workbench drawer, pulled the blue cloth back over the instrument, and went to bed in the corridor outside. A few minutes earlier, Footsteps had stopped for a long time before they moved on, she had heard them. She was fairly certain, now, that she was not imagining it, she did not yet know what to do with the certainty. But she held it carefully. The way you hold something that has not yet told you what it is with attention, and without pressing, Lady Carworth called on a Tuesday in the 4th week of the marriage. Which was 3 days after Margaret had finally succeeded in regluing the bridge and 2 days after the Duke had appeared in the doorway of the instrument room for the first time, looked at the harpsichord without the blue cloth over it, and then looked at Margaret, and said nothing at all. And left. She had not yet decided what that visit meant. She was still turning it over when the footman informed her that Lady Carworth had arrived and was waiting in the green drawing-room. Lady Dorothea found her in the corridor outside the drawing-room and took her arm without preamble. "I Sabi. Lla Carworth," she said quietly, "has been expecting to be the next Duchess of Brookhaven for approximately 2 seasons. She is 23 and genuinely beautiful, in the kind of way that makes rooms rearrange themselves around her when she enters. She is also," Dorothea added, with the precision of someone who has been observing the social landscape for 8 decades, "not a person who forgives a change of plans that I see." Margaret said that I will be sitting by the window. Pay no attention to me. Lady Carworth was everything Lady Dorothea had described. And she was wearing it all with the particular ease of a woman who has never had to think about whether a room would receive her well. She rose when Margaret entered, and took both her hands. And looked at her face with an interest so warm and so complete that it took Margaret a full 3 seconds to understand it as a weapon. "But you are not at all what they say," Lady Carworth said, still holding her hands. Her expression one of delighted discovery. "They have been so unkind in the drawing-rooms, you know I have quite scolded them. I said, she cannot be so very unsuitable, or dear Brookhaven would never, but there. I am running on. We are to be great friends. I insist upon it." Margaret disengaged her hands gently and moved to the tea table. "You are very kind, my lady," she said. "That I have known Marcus since we were children," Lady Carworth continued, settling back into her chair with the ease of a person who considers the furniture already hers. "I know all his moods, all his ways. When he goes silent, and he does go silent, I expect you have noticed when he shuts himself away for days together. It takes years to learn a man like Marcus. Years. And a particular kind of patience." She smiled, and it was a very lovely smile, and it did not reach the part of her eyes that was doing the actual work. "You have had how long now?" "4 weeks, Margaret poured the tea. 4 weeks, yes," she said, "and how are you finding it?" "The house is rather overwhelming at first, I should think. So much of it shut up. So many rooms one isn't quite sure about." A pause, delicate as a quill tip. "And of course the instrument room. I was there once, years ago. When Frances was still alive. She played beautifully. I have always thought it such a great pity, the way it has been left." Margaret handed her the cup. "It isn't being left any longer," she said. Something shifted in Lady Carworth's expression too fast to name. "There and gone." "Recalibrating. You are working on it yourself?" she said. "How extraordinary. Though I suppose with your background your father was in the trade, wasn't he?" Before the she stopped, and let the silence after the stop do its work. "Well, I'm sure it must be a comfort. Having a familiar occupation." Margaret looked at her. She had met Lady Carworth before in 100 different drawing-rooms, wearing 100 different faces. In every year of her life since the money had started going. The cousin who mentioned the dress was a hand-me-down. The neighbor who was so very sorry about the circumstances. She knew the weapon precisely. Because the weapon was always the same. "Here is a thing I have that you do not. I will hold it out as a gift so that you cannot strike it from my hand." "Why father was in the trade," Margaret said. "And is. The unsteadiness in his hand has been improving." She picked up her own cup. "He taught me everything I know about the instrument, which has proven useful." The soundboard damage was more extensive than the initial assessment suggested. "But the wood is sound underneath." Lady Carworth looked at her over the rim of her cup with those beautiful, calculating eyes. "Your father was the one who was engaged to assess it, wasn't he?" she said. Some years ago. Before the disagreement. Another pause. I was present, actually. When the report came back. I was visiting with Frances at the time. She was not well enough to deal with correspondence herself, and Marcus was not himself. It was a difficult period. She set down her cup. I handled quite a lot of the household correspondence that month. As a matter of fact. As a friend, she said it pleasantly. She said it the way you say a thing that is simply a piece of information, offered helpfully, with no edge visible on it at all. Margaret kept her expression where it was. That was very generous of you. She said. One does what one can. Lady Carworth rose, smoothing her skirts. I must not keep you. I only wanted to call and say that I hope we shall be friends truly. Marcus deserves people around him who understand him. It is such a specialized thing. Understanding a man like that. She paused at the door, and her eyes moved once, briefly, to the window that looked out toward the side of the house where the instrument room was. Do give my regards to your work. I hope the instrument recovers. When she had gone, Lady Dorothea rose from the window seat. She handled the household correspondence, Margaret said. Before Dorothea could speak. The month Frances died. She said so herself that I heard. She sent the report back. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. I have suspected something of the kind for some years. I have not been able to prove it. Margaret looked at the door through which Lady Carworth had left. She will come back, she said. It was not a question. Yes, said Lady Dorothea. She will come back. The tools arrived on a Thursday morning. Margaret found them on the workbench in the instrument room when she came in after breakfast. 3 of them. Set in a neat row at the end of the bench closest to the window. A tuning hammer, the handle made of fruitwood, the head fitted with a square socket of exactly the right size for the rest pins of a Flemish instrument. A set of voicing needles, 12 of them. In a leather roll. And a small bone folder, narrower than her current one by a precise 1/4 inch. Which was the precise 1/4 inch that had been making the damper work more difficult than it should have been for the past 2 weeks. She stood and looked at them for a long moment, then she picked up the tuning hammer and examined the socket. It was not a standard size. She knew. Because she had checked 3 instrument makers in the borough and none of them had stocked the correct size for this instrument's pins. The socket had been made to order. Someone had measured the pins, or had someone measure the pins, and provided the measurement to a maker. And had the tool made. She thought about when the pins could have been measured without her being present. She thought about footsteps that stopped outside a door. She set the hammer down and picked up the bone folder. 1/4 inch narrower. She had not mentioned the damper difficulty to anyone. She had not mentioned it because it was the kind of problem you solved by working around it, making adjustments. Finding away the kind of problem that you did not advertise because advertising it felt like admitting that the work was harder than you had made it look. That he had not been in the room. He had been in the doorway, twice, briefly, and both times she had been working on the jacks. Not the dampers. She put the folder down and looked at the window, through which the grey London morning was conducting itself with its usual lack of enthusiasm. She understood something, then, about the shape of his attention. It was not demonstrative. It did not announce itself. It watched. With the same quality of focus he brought to everything, complete, unhurried, precise, and it acted on what it saw without requiring acknowledgement. Without requiring anything, the tools were the acknowledgement. The tools said, I have been watching your hands. I know what they need. I have arranged for them to have it at a tea dinner that evening. She waited until the footman had stepped back from the table. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and set the bone folder on the table between them. That he looked at it. The 1/4 inch is correct. She said that he looked up from the folder to her face. The rest pins required a matatorder socket, she said. You would have needed someone to measure them. The 2nd Thursday. He said. You were at your father's. I asked Wickham to take the measurements. Wickham was the senior footman. She filed this away. The voicing needles are the correct gauge. She said that I consulted a maker in Piccadilly, and the folder. That he said nothing for a moment. Just looked at her across the candles, in the way he had that was not comfortable and was not uncomfortable but was simply entirely present that I observed that you were compensating. He said. In the damper work. The angle of your wrist was wrong for 3 days before I understood what it meant. 3 days. He had watched her compensate for 3 days, cataloging the angle of her wrist. Before he had understood the cause and done something about it, she picked up the bone folder and turned it in her fingers. Thank you, she said. That it was a plain thing to say. It was insufficient. But she had found, in 4 weeks of living in the same house as this man, that the things between them that mattered most were the things said plainly, without ornament, in the full knowledge that the other person was paying attention and would receive them correctly. He inclined his head. The small, precise inclination that she had come to understand meant received, and picked up his fork. The dinner continued. The candles burned. Outside, the spring rain conducted its long conversation with the windows. She kept the bone folder on the table beside her plate for the rest of the meal. He noticed. She knew he noticed because his eyes moved to it once, briefly, and then back to his food. And the corner of his mouth did the thing it sometimes did. Not quite a smile, but the country a smile comes from. That was enough. Later, alone in the instrument room, she struck the tuning fork and held it against the case of the harpsichord, feeling the vibration pass into the old wood. Feeling the wood receive it. This is what being calibrated feels like, she thought. She held the fork there until the note had entirely faded, and then she put it back in the drawer. And went to bed. The harpsichord was finished in the 6th week, not finished in the way that a thing is finished when it has been made perfect. It was not perfect. And Margaret had stopped expecting perfection somewhere around the 3rd week, when she had understood that the instrument did not want to be made into something it had never been. It wanted to be made into itself again, which was a different project entirely. And one that required a different kind of patience. What she meant by finished was this: every jack was cut and voiced and seated correctly. Every string was at tension. The soundboard crack had been stabilized and cleated and would not move further. Though the crack would always be visible to anyone who opened the lid and looked, a thin dark line running along the bass register from pin block toward bridge. The history of the wood written into the wood. The bridge was reglued. The dampers replaced. The jacks moved freely through their slots without buzzing or sticking. The tuning held that it was not the instrument it had been before Francis had played it for the last time on a spring morning 6 years ago. That instrument was gone, the way everything is gone that has been through time without being maintained, not destroyed, but altered. Made into a record of its own experience. What Margaret had made was something that contained the original and the interval both. The crack was in it. The years were in it. The new strings and the old wood were in it together. Which seemed to her a reasonable description of most things worth having. She tuned it on a Thursday morning, alone, using the tuning fork her mother had bought from a Flemish craftsman in the year Margaret was born. She worked from the bottom of the register to the top, setting each unison. Checking each interval, adjusting where the string tension had shifted in the hours since the previous tuning. It took 2 hours. When she had finished, she struck the fork one last time, held it to the case, felt the vibration move into the wood, and listened to the instrument ring back at the same pitch in tune. Itself. She put the fork in her pocket and closed the lid. The summer came late that year, which was not unusual, and when it came all at once. The way London summers do, suddenly and briefly, and with a quality of light that made the city look like a different city for 3 weeks before the autumn arrived to correct the impression. Her father came up from the country in July. He was better than he had been in 2 years. The shaking in his right hand had not stopped, but it had become manageable, and he had been working again on small repairs, the kind that could be done seated, at a bench in the cottage garden. In the afternoons when the light was good, he arrived with a package under his arm and a look on his face that Margaret recognized as the look of a man who has spent a great deal of time preparing not to weep and is not confident the preparation will hold. She took him to the instrument room. He stood in the doorway for a long time without going in. Then he went in, and walked once around the harpsichord without touching it, and stood at the bass end and looked at the soundboard through the open lid. You cleated it, he said, from below. 3 cleats. Following the grain. He nodded. He ran one finger along the edge of the crack, the same gesture she had made on the first day, the same impulse, the same inheritance. The pine resin repair is still there. Under your cleats that I left it. She said. It had been there 40 years. It seemed wrong to remove it. He was quiet for a long moment. That I documented it, he said. In the report. The original repair. The new fracture developing along the same grain line. I documented all of it. He straightened and looked at her. Do you know what happened to the report? I know, she said. That he searched her face. That it has been addressed. She said. Not in the way I would have chosen. But addressed. That he seemed to understand that the full account of it would come in time, and that time was not now. And that what was needed now was for him to be in this room with the instrument he had been prevented from helping for 7 years, and to see that it was whole. That he sat down at the bench. That he sat there for a while without playing. His right hand rested on the closed lid. And his left hand rested in his lap, and he simply sat in the room with the instrument, breathing. Then he placed both hands on the keys and played a scale. The sound that came out was the sound Margaret had been working toward for 6 weeks, warm in the lower register, clear in the upper. The slight darkness of old wood in the bass that no amount of new string could entirely correct, and that she had decided was not something to be corrected but something to be kept. Her father played the scale up and back again. That he did not weep. Neither did she. They had agreed on this without discussing it, because some understandings between certain people do not require discussion. That he played for a few minutes, nothing formal, nothing particular, simply the sound of a man's hands remembering a thing they had always known how to do. When he stopped, the room held the last note for a moment before releasing it. Your mother would have liked this, he said. That I know, Margaret said. I thought about her the whole time. That autumn, a letter arrived from Wiltshire. That it was brief, and it was in a hand Margaret did not immediately recognize. And it said, I have planted a border of stalks along the south wall of the garden here. They have come up well. I think of your green drawing room sometimes, and of the things that were said there, and I hope you are well. I see. Margaret read it twice. Then she took it to the library, where the Duke was working, and set it on his desk without comment, and went back to the instrument room. He read it. She did not ask him what he thought about it. That evening at dinner, she said, stalks do best against a warm wall, with some shade in the afternoon. If she has planted them in full sun they may struggle. He looked at her across the candles. Should I tell her? He said. That I will write to her, Margaret said. In the spring, if they do not come up. They did not speak of it again. The world, which had been certain that the marriage would fail within the season, found other things to be certain about. The drawing rooms that had predicted disgrace moved on to other predictions. The house on the corner of the square became, over time, simply a house on the corner of the square. One that was not often the source of the kind of material the drawing rooms preferred, because the Duchess of Brookhaven did not give grand entertainments and did not gamble and was not having an affair with anyone and was not, by any conventional measure, interesting. She was known to play the harpsichord. Word went around that the instrument, the late Duchess harpsichord, sealed for years, damaged, considered a loss, had been fully restored by the current Duchess herself, using methods she had learned from her father. It was said she played it badly, which was not entirely untrue. She had grown up tuning instruments, not playing them. And the transition between knowing what a correct note sounded like and being able to reliably produce it with one's hands was a longer project than she had anticipated. She was working on it. She was, by this time, also working on teaching the Duke. This had not been planned. It had begun one evening when he had come into the instrument room and sat in the chair she kept in the corner, and watched her practice, and after a while said, in the careful voice he used for things he was not certain of, "Is it difficult to begin from the beginning?" At this age, she had moved over on the bench. "Sit," she had said. "He'll show you the first position." That he had learned slowly, and with the focused, slightly painful quality of a person who is accustomed to being competent at things and is finding the experience of being a beginner considerably less agreeable than they had anticipated. He played scales incorrectly for 3 weeks. He hit the same wrong note in the same passage for 11 consecutive days, and on the 11th day she moved his finger to the correct key without comment, and on the 12th day he played it right, and neither of them said anything about it that he would not be a musician. That was not the point was that every evening, in the room where Francis had played on winter mornings before anyone else was awake, there were two people at the bench together, and the instrument was sounding, and the house was not the wrong size that I and the drawer of the workbench in the instrument room, under a chamois cloth. Next to the voicing needles and the spare strings and the collection of old quills kept against future need. There was a tuning fork that it was old. The metal had the particular color of something that has been handled for years by hands that knew what they were doing. The pitch it produced was exact, as it had always been. As it would continue to be for as long as the metal held its form. That it had been Margaret's mother's, and it had been Margaret's. And some years later it would belong to someone else who would learn its weight and its frequency and the precise angle at which it needed to be struck to produce the cleanest note, but that was a different story. This one ends here. A house that had been the wrong size for 6 years. Full of light. A door that had been locked standing open. An instrument playing in a room that had been silent, two unpracticed hands on the keys, finding their way through the same passage they had been working on for a week, getting it almost right. Getting it a little more right each time. The note. The correction. The note again, that is what calibration is, not a single moment of perfection, but the long, patient, repeated work of finding the true pitch and returning to it, over and over, for as long as the strings hold.